Techsauce Global, sparking innovative thoughts. As we start the new year of 2022, definitely the question is, where are we heading towards? How are companies going to approach their business strategies? How can they grow, but at the same time have a positive impact into the environment and the world? And so we're going to talk about the concept of net positive approach, a new way of doing business and creating sustainable strategy. And I'm Shawarat Yongji Pupe, a global content editor at Techsauce Media. And today joining me is Andrew Winston, the manager of Winston Eco-Strategies of LLC. He is known as the expert on megatrends and how to build companies, having gained a lot of success with his latest book, Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, which is co-authored by CEO Paul Pullman. Hello, or should I say Swadika, Andrew?
Hello, good to see you.
I'm so happy to be able to talk to you across the borders as you are in the United States and I'm here in Thailand. First off, can you talk a little bit about your background for those who might not be so familiar with your work here in Southeast Asia, and briefly about the net positive approach?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Since the pandemic, we've all been able to travel the world, virtually. So I've had the opportunity to do a lot of these kinds of conversations, and it's great to be able to speak to people in Thailand. So my background is in business. I came out of school with an economics degree and worked at Boston Consulting Group. That was my first job as a consultant, and I did strategy and biz dev kind of jobs, regular jobs in companies, and then kind of had a value shift about 20 years ago and decided to pursue an interest and passion in really how the world worked and how companies interact with the natural world and with society. And so I've spent, 20 years writing books, working with companies directly, speaking around the world, advising companies, doing work with companies in many different ways to help them understand the really big trends, to understand why they're feeling so much pressure now to manage and improve their environmental and social impacts. And my new book, the latest one, is Net Positive, with Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever for a decade. And the case that we make is that we need to move much faster than we have been, that companies have been improving, but it's not fast enough given what we're facing, the science that we face, and that we need to build companies that serve the world, that profit by solving the world's problems, not by causing them.
There are definitely challenges that we've seen in the past for the corporate side and also everybody else in terms of the big stakeholders into how can we navigate the world of consumerism and at the same time have a positive impact. We've had, of course, a very life-changing time in the past 2 years with COVID-19, accelerating a lot of change. But as you said, the uptake in terms of how companies have worked towards changing the way they work and bringing about a positive impact might be slow. Has there been a difference in the speed in how companies have changed in the recent couple of years?
Absolutely. I think the last 2 or 3 years, there's been more change in what's expected of companies and the pressure they feel and the different areas they feel they need to have a stance or have a position on. There's been more change in the last few years than in the 20 years before it. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the pandemic did focus companies. They were pushed to do what was right at times and not worry as much about what it costs, immediately. And there were social movements that built, racial and gender social movements that built during this time. But also the kind of megatrends that I've been studying and talking about for years, in particular things like climate change and inequality, they've gotten worse and they've accelerated, and companies aren't really debating anymore whether there's a climate change problem. We finally kind of moved past the first step of getting everyone to be talking about this and understanding it. So there's much more happening than ever before, but at the same time, it's not really fast enough yet. And so it's a kind of mixed feeling if you're working in this field, because you see the progress and companies are doing more and more. but the science, the horizon we're shooting for, what we're trying to solve is getting harder, right? It's moving away from us. So it's kind of a mixed emotion in this field.
Could you say maybe perhaps, I mean, I just wanted to follow up on this issue is like perhaps maybe it's because we've created or built such a system that is ingrained in our society or ingrained in the way things that have been done. I mean, I would think perhaps, in terms of my talks to experts about smart city building, sometimes, old cities or cities where they've already developed at a certain level, it's hard for them to shift. It's hard for them to pivot and change the way things that they've been doing versus like if you were to start like just anew, with a clean slate. Do you think that that's one of the biggest challenges in terms of how companies are kind of lagging behind in terms of responding to the concerns of the public and responding to what people want to be changed?
Look, I think big companies have always had their pros and cons.
Mm-hmm.
The scale and the resources they have means that they can have a big impact for good or bad, but they also don't move that quickly. And I think innovation and change, it almost always comes from smaller companies.
Mm-hmm.
And the big ones help those companies accelerate, or they buy them, or they kind of bring them into the fold. So yes, I think there's inertia, right? There's tremendous inertia, but there's an underlying problem that you're getting at, which is the kind of story that we've all been told about the purpose of business is, for about 40, 50 years has been very clearly shareholder value, short-term shareholder value. And it's become almost unquestioned that that's the only purpose of a business. And it's actually a very strange definition of a purpose, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
there's many ways you could make money. And the question is, what are you doing to make that money? What is the thing you do for a customer? What's the problem you solve in the world? That's the real purpose of any business, is to solve some problem or provide something to people and then make money because they do that well, right? And we've kind of gotten switched on this. And when you only put profits first, you make poor decisions, especially for the long run. You don't invest for the long run. And we're seeing that I think at the company level, but really at the society and economy level. We're not investing for the future and dealing with our longer term problems because everything's about kind of right now, this quarter. And we're going to have to move away from that story and into a much better one that's more humane and brings everyone along into a thriving future.
It's scary. It's scary, especially when you see a lot of stories nowadays in terms of, for example, the other day I heard about fast fashion, where it's still a big problem, and countries are dealing with how to, dispose of the excess of our culture. Let's go into corporate responsibility then. You've been in the business for quite a while now, and you've said that there has been change. How has the word or the nature of corporate responsibility evolved?
Well, I think we've been through different phases, and all companies kind of go through a progression. And I think corporate social responsibility was needed, when it probably got started 30, 40 years ago, just to say to companies, you do have a responsibility to society in a very basic level, but it's been used mainly in some sense as like a philanthropic thing, companies doing good. And what's evolved is a deeper understanding of what people have called sustainability. People are now calling things ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, which I don't think is a very helpful acronym, but it's become very common. But it's, companies go through this progression where they realize, this philanthropic approach is pretty narrow and doesn't really achieve very much. And companies should be philanthropic, just like we all should be as humans, but it doesn't really get much done. That the real value is in using your business, using your products and services to solve the world's problems and do that profitably, and use the tools of economics and markets and competition to do that well and to profit doing it. That's a much bigger impact than just throwing some money at some charities or, doing a tree planting day once a year. That it's really about what the company does, where its resources go, where it spends its money, what it has its people doing for the world. And that's where the scale of impact really grows.
It's quite, as a lot of things in life, easy to say, but hard to do in terms of I think a lot of good companies, when they start out, startups as well, who might be listening to this podcast, you start out with something it's quite pure. You want to solve a problem, but at the end of the day, you do have to run a business. Many companies are working towards being less, quote, bad in terms of reducing what they create, but how can they do it? So let's talk about the how. Let's talk about your vision of the future in terms of net positive. What is net positive?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to quickly answer your point about, they have to run a business. Well, sure. But if you think about the fast fashion example you gave, or the food business where we're throwing out 40% of food, that's a waste, right? That's not economic, right? For everyone, for there to be that much waste in a system. So that's always kind of business opportunity to become leaner, to become more eco-efficient at the very least. So the net positive approach is, we ask a kind of fundamental question, which is the world better off because your business is in it? And if you can answer that as a yes, then you're really doing something, right? Because most companies, I don't think, can answer that as a yes yet. I think there's parts of businesses that are in the right place, that are going at the right speed. But for the most part, it's a difficult task. As you said, it's hard. So a net positive business is one that improves the well-being of everyone that they touch, every stakeholder, their employees, their consumers and customers, the communities they operate in, their suppliers, and on and on. And they do that through everything they do. They're every product, every service, every factory, every country they operate in. Now, this is a North Star. This is kind of a mission. Again, nobody's really there yet, but there's a lot of companies on the way and doing it in parts of their business. So to make this happen, and that's really what the whole book is about, is kind of going through these major categories of how do you do this? How do you become a company like this? It starts with purpose. It starts with your own personal vision and purpose for what are you doing here on the planet? What are you doing at work? What do you care about? And then bringing that to the organization, and starts from meaning and then builds from there to thinking in bigger ways about the impact of the business, taking ownership for the impacts you have more broadly, building trust and transparency with the world, and then getting to a place where you can form real partnerships and collaborations. And that's really the heart of the book is collaborations with your peers and competitors, with your employees, with your suppliers, with governments and civil society to solve the bigger problems together and make business better, but together. And that's the only way we'll get to scale.
I just wanted to follow up on that as well, in terms of what we've talked about, fast fashion and everything, in case we don't come back to this. It's interesting because it is a really important relationship that we're seeing between the corporate side, the private side, and the consumers or the market. We've seen, as you mentioned, the market or the consumers trying to lead the private sector to positive impact. But what if it's the other way around, in terms of how the market is so used to consuming, like, for example, fast fashion in such a speed and in such a vast amount of consumption? How can the corporate shift the behavior of the market that might have already gone to a point where I don't know how you're going to bring them back? Actually, in the past, we have been successful, right? We've seen success in changing our behavior as well.
It's hard, right? Changing behavior is really difficult. There have been some success stories, right? I think we've, but sometimes and often it comes with some level of government intervention, some mandate, right? We've gotten safer about driving because there's been rules about, seatbelts and airbags and the kinds of things that companies need to do. And then they innovate and create much safer vehicles, right? So there's things that have improved. If you take a look kind of at the macro numbers of the world and the number of people in dire poverty, for example, there's more than there used to be because the population's so much bigger, but the percentages drop. There's actually fewer people in dire poverty than there was before. So there's been growth. There's been some improvement in the world. But, a lot of that gain has come at the cost of our natural world, and the natural world isn't something that we just go visit for fun. It's actually what supports our existence, right? It isn't a disconnected thing. So there's this need to kind of see the connections in all this and how much what we do in one place affects what we do in others. So the problem that you're kind of getting at is that, businesses have been built around growth at all costs. And that means convincing people to consume more and more stuff. And there is a tension here because it's been shown pretty repeatedly that more and more stuff isn't what makes people happy past a certain point, right? Past the point of having enough, having enough for their family, their kids having opportunities to go to school and grow. And more stuff doesn't actually make people happier generally. So there is a disconnect. I think we have to face that. And we talk kind of at the end of the book about the really big kind of global and societal challenges that we all have to kind of deal with together. And that includes consumption. And where does consumption need to get controlled? Probably in the richer countries, while allowing the 1 billion or 2 billion people that need to come out of poverty to use more, right? To use more stuff, but still stay within the limits of the planet. It's a challenge. But it means we have to do a lot of things at once, right? We have to make the economy much cleaner. We have to get more circular in how we use products so we reuse it, don't waste as much, and provide some of the quality of life to people with a smaller footprint. So a village that has no power should get solar and wind, not a diesel, engine, and not plug into the grid. I mean, that's what we're going to see is kind of a leapfrog to cleaner technology so we can grow without as much impact. And that's the kind of decoupling that we need so that we can get there.
Excellent. I know you talked about how there have been many terms coming in terms of corporate responsibility. You've seen terms like by compliance to beyond compliance, from now, of course, net zero to net positive. What would be the next thing to come, do you think?
Well, I'm hoping, and I believe net positive is a very broad term. We chose it, on purpose to be understandable, right? That's kind of part of selling something, is people to kind of get a sense of, okay, doing what I do, does it have a positive impact? The other words that you're hearing a lot now and that are equivalent, they're very similar, is regenerative. It's something that kind of heals and improves, restorative, which is similar. I think that's all where we're headed. Net positive and regenerative are very, very similar. I mean, they're essentially the same thing. What it means is, again, that we're recognizing where we've caused damage to the environment and to society. And we're not just kind of reducing our damage to zero. We're trying to fix it. We're trying to make the system healthier, and make people healthier, right? So imagine there's, more products in the world that make you healthier instead of ones that end up producing pollution and make you unhealthy. And there's, not plastics in our system down the road because we stop making things that accumulate in our bodies. This is where we're headed, and we have to. But I think it's, whatever the term is, we're going to see more and more partnership and collaboration. We have to. There's really no way to solve these problems. They're too big. There's no company big enough to tackle these things alone, no country big enough. It has to be kind of often global efforts.
You've written about the term blowing up boundaries. What does that mean?
Well, we talk about it in a kind of mental boundaries that, when you start by getting your purpose together, kind of getting your own house in order, you then need to start setting kind of more aggressive goals for what your business is going to do. And there's a huge growth in that, right? There's a quarter of the world's largest companies now have science-based targets, which means they've committed to cut carbon at the pace that science demands, not just what they think they can do. And that's a good example of what we're talking about. The boundary is kind of both the boundaries of the business itself, what people call the four walls, like just operating in your own factory, your own business, and thinking, what do we have to do for our part in the larger kind of outside in thinking of the problems and thresholds in the world? That's blowing up a boundary, but it's a mental boundary, really. And when you start thinking bigger, you start thinking about your whole supply chain, your whole value chain, and realize that, just saying, I want to have zero waste in my factory is great. But if you don't start talking to suppliers and even customers, it's going to be really hard to do, right? You need the whole system so that suppliers are sending you things that can be recycled, that are in packaging that can be recycled. I mean, it's a partnership, and it has to be. And that's what we mean. You take the boundaries of the physical space and the mental space and kind of just blow them out and say, think bigger, think outside in. Working
together, because you can't do it alone. Right. But talking about doing it and actually getting things done. often, as you said, or I said, companies, they reach a point where they think, okay, we have to run a business. We have to operate. We need money. And they might think we can't afford sustainability. How should they go about investing and spending money?
Well, you use the right word there, which is invest. I mean, the question you just asked, which is, how can they afford sustainability? I think I've gotten in every interview for 20 years, and I've done a lot in podcasts and writing, and it's always the same question, because it goes back to that story I was talking about, where the purpose of a business is maximizing shareholder value. So if you have some other thing you're trying to do, it must be drawing you away from the core purpose. It must be hurting the business, which is kind of ludicrous, really. I mean, there are many things that fall under the sustainability name that clearly save money, right? Like getting more efficient in your business. There's things that are called innovation, right? You create products that are more sustainable, that satisfy your customers, that help your business customers or consumers be more sustainable in their operations and their lives. That's innovation that's worth investing in. So the word is invest, not spend. And the reality is everything in business is an investment. If you're going to do marketing, you're going to do R&D, you're going to invest in your people. It's an investment. It's only when we talk about sustainability do people say it's an expense, right? It's like they don't as naturally see the return, right? But when you put it in normal business terms, which is, well, you're going to innovate to solve sustainability problems, it's innovation. You're going to attract and retain the best people because of what you're doing on sustainability. That's a value to the business, right? So it's normal business value. It just comes through thinking differently and thinking about the problems you're trying to solve. So it is an investment, right? There are going to be investments. And like with all capital investments, you have to make decisions about, where you think the best payback's going to be. But I would just say that we've become so short-sighted that we don't invest in the long run. And in the end, that's bad for the business and for the economy.
Would you say that it's a short term or long term that we're looking at? Because it's kind of tricky, especially when you're talking about nowadays, where there's startups, there's tech, there's innovation, and the timeline for testing out something shortens very fast. From years to months. How should, now this leads to my next question, how should personal leadership look like then? What do net positive leaders look like? How should they view their strategy thinking and approach this?
Well, look, the best leaders have always been, people who can balance lots of different demands and balance the short and long term, right? There's always going to be, of course, you have a short-term need to have profit, to have cash flows, to have the leeway to do things for the longer haul. We believe that, the core of what a net positive leader looks like is really around being more humane, being human, bringing yourself to work and having a purpose personally, having empathy and compassion, having humility. It actually takes a lot of humility to say to the world, we want to cut carbon by 50% and we don't know how, and we need help from NGOs or from our customers, from our suppliers, that we don't know the answer. And that's what most companies are doing now when they set these really big goals. They don't know exactly how to get there, and they're being open about that and transparent. And that takes both humility, but also, what's the core principle of a net positive leader, which is courage. You need the courage to say, I'm going to push back on this quarterly pressure. I'm going to build my business for the long run. And I'm going to work with competitors and work with the government and work with, people I'm not always comfortable with to get to better outcomes. That takes courage to push back on the story. There's peer pressure. It's not just when you're a kid in high school. Yeah. CEOs feel peer pressure, right? I see it now being out in the world again as there's more and more meetings that are in person. And there's clearly kind of peer pressure about whether you're wearing a mask or not, and there's this kind of group think about it, even with all, middle-aged people who are supposed to be independent thinkers. So I think there's a lot of kind of group think within companies and leadership, and you need the courage to kind of say, what's the right thing to do here for the business and for the world?
I like how you said that. And I think it's really good in terms of how people can imagine what the challenges are and how we are in fact, just all humans at all different levels of leadership. But from the corporate side, now that you say that, okay, let's say, for example, you're corporate, your private sector, you want to change. Of course, as you said, things can't be done without partnership. Things need collaboration. Let's take a look at the different leadership in the United States now.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of multiple global meetings this year, like the climate conference. What does it look like now, and how does it affect business?
Look, the previous president and administration didn't believe in climate change. Actually said it was maybe a hoax. It was an attack from China. And they pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. So to say there's a difference between the last one and this one is an understatement. There's clearly an enormous difference. The U.S. is having trouble passing the legislation now, the Build Back Better bill that would have a lot of spending on climate because the politics and because there's not enough people who want to act on climate change. But those bills are not the only way that governments impact. This government and the cabinet, they all talk about climate change. The head of the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Secretary, Secretary of Defense, they've all been talking about it since they took office. And that's a huge difference. And I think it really matters for sending the message across the government, across the world, that we are serious. The challenge obviously is that the power can change hands again. And the US has become a very unstable democracy, which I never thought I'd say in my lifetime, but it's true. And it's the country's in a lot of trouble. And we could easily be going back to people who not only don't want to tackle climate change, they want to prop up fossil fuels. They want to keep the way things are going as long as possible. And, yes, I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But I think the only way it doesn't is if people stand up, they rise up, they vote for people who want to take action. But, in the current world, the government of the U.S. is going to ask business to do more, right? And that's a good thing. I think the U.S. companies have suffered when they've been not pushed to raise standards, like auto companies, to raise their fuel efficiency. It's better for them to compete with the rest of the world to hit higher standards. It's better when the government is pushing for more renewable energy, so we get better at it, lower the costs, and on and on. So, I hope we maintain that pressure, but it could come and go, like politics.
Yeah. And the rest of the world, of course, is just progressing as well at their own pace here in Thailand and Southeast Asia as well. Your book, your writing has been translated in many languages. I'm sure you've seen and observed how the reactions have been towards your concept of net positive throughout the world. How have you seen how has the reaction been? How do you think we can convince organizations in Thailand and Southeast Asia to move towards being more net positive?
Yeah. So if you can see over my shoulder on the bookshelf, you can see there's a Japanese and Chinese version of my last book, The Big Pivot. And we'll have about 10 or 12 languages this year of net positive and probably more. Look, I can't say I'm an expert on the cultures and business communities in what are very different countries, right? I mean, I think often in the US or the West, you just say Asia as if it's one. Korea is some resistance to the ESG pressure. I've heard repeatedly companies say it feels like it's coming from the West. It's just something they're demanding, or the investors from Europe and the US are demanding. And I get that. I try to encourage companies to think about the pressures that are building are not coming from a specific customer, or a specific bank or investor. They're coming from the world, from the literally the natural world. We're trying to hit these thresholds with climate, and from just societal needs to reduce inequality, to reduce suffering. It isn't driven by a given company or government. It's driven by the problems. And that's the way I think to bring it into any culture, is to say, don't we want to solve these problems for ourselves and for everyone? I've also found often that in some cultures, setting a big goal without knowing exactly how to get there is tough emotionally and culturally. Like there's some cultures, both I think globally and even just types of companies, like engineering types companies, they want the exact numbers, right? They want to know exactly how to get there.
To know.
And we can't do that. We can't do that now. We have to hit these goals based on what the world needs. And that's very difficult. So look, I think if you take it out of the context of it's coming from one place or not, and just say this is what the world needs, and in a way bring it down to the local level. Like, what's climate change doing to Thailand? I can't tell you, but I'm sure it's something. Right?
Haze. I'll tell you, haze. We are. Never in my lifetime for the past few years we've seen haze. I would think that we would see something like what we see in the TV screens, in China.
Yeah.
But
when the cities are getting hotter, everything's getting hotter, right? And that makes it harder to live, harder to work outside. I'm sure you get hit by bigger, stronger typhoons or storms, floods. There's all of it, and it is a local problem as much as it is global.
Yeah, a lot of us. Last issue then, of course, is how. More about your last comments on those companies or leaders or people in business who might be listening to this podcast, and how can they get started on the road towards net positive? You said set a goal, right? Without possibly knowing how to do it. What should they do? And what is your vision for sustainability in the year to come?
Yeah. So we have the book itself is structured as a how-to. So there's a lot in there about how do you do this. So the easy answer is to get the book. I hope that people will. And the people are buying it all over the world, right now in English or in the audiobook in English until there's translations, but it's selling everywhere. There's a lot of obviously English speaking people in business across the world. But the starting point, we have there's a website for the book called netpositive.world. And we have on there what we call a readiness assessment. It's just 25 questions to kind of stop and think about. And the first 4 or 5 are really the starting point. And some companies kind of are already there and can answer these questions. But they're things like, do I know or understand the world's megatrends like climate and inequality and how they impact my business? Do I understand how my business impacts them? Do I know my suppliers and customers, like the whole value chain? What's the footprint of it? Do I know that? Do I know what my stakeholders expect? What do my customers and employees want from me from today and tomorrow? So it's about getting kind of basic information together. And then you'll have a better sense of where's our footprint? What things do we need to work on? And then you're better prepared to go create and work in some of these partnerships that we need. And that's kind of the next level. And some companies, like I said, are already there. So I think that's part of the starting point as an organization, but individually, it in a way, it's again, starting with yourself, asking, do you care? Do you care that there's, hundreds of millions of people going to bed hungry every night, that the climate is becoming destabilized and places will become unlivable? Low-lying nations are in trouble, right? Low-lying cities. How much do you care? And how do you cultivate more caring and empathy? How do you cultivate more courage? And I think some of that comes from collective courage, doing things with others, doing it together, putting it out there that this is what I want to do. I want to have more purpose in my business, and seeing how many people arrive at your door ready to do the same thing. I mean, I'm very inspired by, Gen Z in particular, young millennials like yourself. There's more of a mission in their thinking, in what they're looking for in work, right? They want meaning and values. And I think that's possibly going to save us.
Andrew, thank you for that. I'm serious. Our talk has been very down to earth. It's not something lofty that, a concept that you can't touch. It's definitely something that I feel that I myself have found very useful and very practical. And it's something that innately is in all of us. You're right. We all want to have something positive come out of our lives. This is why humans are the way we are, or else we're just depressed. We just sit in the couch, couch all day long. True.
We want meaning. That's been proven many times, right? We're not just competitive. We don't just want stuff. We do. Yeah. Everyone wants stuff, but we also want meaning and connection. Yeah. And that's part of what's the pandemic has shown, right? It's exhausting to be so disconnected, right? Zoom is good. It's been better than we thought it would be, but it's not the same. Right. As seeing your loved ones in person, or even colleagues and friends. And so I'm hoping we can all, come out of this in the next year
Andrew, we want you to come to Thailand as well, and we hope to see you on our Techsauce stage.
That would be great someday. I would like to get there. I would love to.
Thank you so much for our talk.
Thank you.
That's Andrew Winston, the manager of Winston Eco-Strategies LLC. Of course, you can check him out as well as the concept of net positive approach, and get his book. And hopefully, we'll have more translations to come. Thank you so much, Andrew. Kapun ka.
Techsauce, sparking innovative thoughts.